My name is Alan Woods. I'm a Marxist historian and a revolutionary, naturally. And I've come here today to dispel some common myths about the Second World War and hopefully to set the record straight.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communism.
The communist.
The communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. In a couple of weeks, it will mark 80 years since Victory in Europe Day, where Nazi Germany officially surrendered to the Allies in World War II. One of the most significant conflicts in world history, and certainly one of the most mythologized. And to talk about World War II, about the real history that you won't have been taught in school and won't have seen on the History Channel, we have with us Alan Woods, who is a Marxist theorist and historian. He's written many books about various revolutions, events in history and wars, and we're very excited to have him on the show. Alan, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
We're a bit obsessed with World War II here in Britain. I remember I was taught about it in school, and the way that it was taught to me, we're led to believe that Winston Churchill and the Americans more or less single-handedly led the free world to victory over Hitler and Nazi Germany. And how does this view of World War II compare with reality?
Well, of course, that's completely false. In reality, it was Clint Eastwood and John Wayne and a couple of other people that won the war single-handedly. So we've been given to believe by decades of Hollywood films and, as you say, also in the schools, the textbooks, the history books. A whole mythology has been created, which bears no relation, if you look at the facts, bears no, and there are plenty of facts to look at, bears no relation whatsoever to the truth. Let me give you a case in point of the distortion which is taking place. It's really quite astounding, you know. It's coming up to the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. In fact, I think it's already taken place, hasn't it?
Yes, it's already taken place.
It's taken place. That's right. And at this, of course, all the Allied representatives were present, with one notable exception. No Russians were present at that, because none were invited. Now, this is a bit surprising if you bear in mind the fact, and it is a fact. The people who liberated Auschwitz were not the British or the Americans or the French or anything like that. It was precisely the Russian Red Army. And yet they're excluded. And in general, see, that's just one striking instance of a general phenomenon, actually, that the role of the Soviet Union in the war has been systematically excluded. And it's presented, as you correctly say, at least in Europe. Of course, the war in Asia, in the Pacific, is a bit different. Although even there, Russia played a role, if the truth were to be told. But you see, the truth of the matter is that as far as the war in Europe is concerned, and we're here dealing with an anniversary of the victory in Europe, that victory was really carried out by the Soviet Union, by the Red Army. Nobody else. As a matter of fact, the truth of the matter is that the British and Americans, for the majority of the time, right up until the very last minute, up until the D-Day landings of 1944, which was very late in the day, were mere onlookers in this titanic struggle between great powers, which is the Soviet Union on the one hand, and Hitler's Germany with all of the resources of Europe behind it. And that's the fact of the matter. But to this very day, they will not admit this. Not if hell freezes over when they admit it. But it's a fact.
Now, I mentioned that we're taught a certain view of World War II in school, and I took the liberty of looking up a GCSE textbook. So this is something which is taught to British school children, which talks about the conclusion of the war. It says that on the 8th of May, 1945, Winston Churchill stood on a Whitehall balcony and addressed the excited crowd below. Churchill had stood against Hitler and won. The day was his. Can we just take a bit of an aside to talk about the figure of Winston Churchill? Because he's one of the most celebrated figures, certainly for the British bourgeois and most official histories of World War II. But what kind of a character was Winston Churchill?
Well, that's an interesting question. He certainly was a very complex character. But yes, there is in fact a whole mythology about Churchill which is quite unjustified. For example, that he was a great war leader. He was nothing of the sort. Winston Churchill, on 2 occasions in his life, where he played a prominent role in warfare involving Great Britain, that's the First World War. I think he was the head of the Admiralty.
Yes.
And in the Second World War, when he was the Prime Minister, on both occasions he made a complete mess of things. He was responsible for an appalling defeat in the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli adventure, which cost thousands of lives. And in fact, he was forced to resign as a result of that. And in the Second World War also, which we can deal with if you wish, but he was responsible for deliberately preventing the opening of a second front in France against Germany to help the Soviet Union, which was fighting with its back to the wall, and instead advocated the invasion of Italy, which was supposed to be the soft underbelly of the Axis powers of Germany and Italy. False, but completely false, by the way. And that again caused very heavy casualties and led almost nowhere, as a matter of fact. So that's wrong. The other myth is that Churchill is a big defender of democracy and an opponent of fascism. Well, not true. Not true at all. As a matter of fact, let's leave Germany to one side. He was definitely suspicious of Germany for reasons which are known. Not so in the case of Italy. In fact, he was full of praise for Mussolini and Mussolini's fascism from the very word go. He regarded Mussolini as protecting Western civilization against Bolshevism, against the evils of Leninism, as he'd put it, and was full of praise for Mussolini right up to the time in the Second World War when, of course, Italy ended up in the same camp as Hitler. So his democratic credentials are more than questionable, so we put it mildly. By the way, extremely anti-Semitic and racist all his life. You can look, many speeches can demonstrate that fact. Not just that, the whole of the British establishment was rife with Nazi and pro-German sympathisers, up to and including the very top level, the royal family itself, you know. I mean, take the case of the man who became king of England before the war, Edward VIII. There's a whole romantic lot of nonsense talked about this, about his romantic attachment of this American woman and so on and so forth, that he was supposed to have given up the throne for that reason. Not at all. It's not generally realised. To this day, it's not fully. Sometimes they publish programmes about it, but I mean, it was a notorious fact. Edward was a Nazi, was a Nazi sympathiser. It was notorious, it was open, it was notorious. For example, he made a trip to visit Hitler in the late 1900s. He was greeted as a hero. As a matter of fact, he had to resign because his views were becoming too notorious and too dangerous for the establishment. But during the war, they quickly got rid of him. They shuffled him off to the Bahamas, where they thought he could do least damage. Hitler's plan was to make him the King of England in the event of him managing a successful invasion of Britain. This is a fact. And not only that, that is known. I mean, many people know about Edward now. Now it's common knowledge. What's not so well known, in fact, very little known, his brother, who became King George, Bertie, his brother Bertie, who became George, the father of the Queen Elizabeth, was himself a Nazi sympathiser.
Best known these days for appearing in the King's Speech and bravely overcoming his stammer. Oh
yes, he bravely overcame his stammer, but and he also overcame, by various means, managed to suppress all information, because there was plenty of written information about his, documentary information about his links with the Nazis and with the German regime. Before the war, that was, at least up to and including the beginning of the war. And the same was true of a large section of the British establishment, who were in favour of peace with Hitler. They were much more antagonistic and hostile to the Soviet Union than what they were to Soviet Germany, I would argue, throughout. But we'll come back to that later on.
World War II is usually depicted as this big clash between democracy and fascism and autocracy, and the causes for the war are poorly understood. What were the real causes of World War II? And related to that, how do we explain the rise of fascism in Europe as a mass force?
Well, first of all, let us begin by saying what it was not. The Second World War was emphatically not a war for the defense of democracy against fascism. And the whole record of Western imperialism, of Britain in the first instance, also France, also the United States, all of them, was bitter hatred of the Russian Revolution and fear of the Russian Revolution, fear of the threat of communism, of Bolshevism, and so on and so forth. And many, if not most of these people, actually, including the big press, the big newspapers, the press barons and so on, looked with favour upon the rise of fascism, for example, in Italy, where Mussolini's coup d'etat, the takeover by the fascists, was regarded as a safeguard against revolution, because Italy at that time, 1919, 1920, 1921, was faced precisely with the communist revolution. There was a huge movement of the working class, occupation of the factories and so on. Now, Mussolini served with his stormtroopers and so on, put an end to that, introduced order. And that was widely applauded, particularly in Britain, by most of the establishment, as I've said, in the first instance, by Winston Churchill himself. Hitler is a similar case in point. Hitler was seen by most of the establishment as a bulwark against communism in Germany. Hitler took power, by the way, people forget that fact, at the time. See, it is often stated, it's claimed, it's insinuated, that Hitler came to power supported by the German people. That's a lie. As a matter of fact, right towards the end, Hitler got less votes than the communists and socialists together, if they'd have united, which they didn't do, which is the whole tragedy and the crime of both the Social Democrats and the Stalinists. But in any case, there were millions of communist and socialist workers and trade unionists in Germany who opposed Hitler actively, even to the extent of risking their lives in street battles and so on. Hitler, in that sense, saved Germany from communism. And by the way, he was backed by German industrialists, including German Jewish financiers, actually, also, because they didn't believe that he was really serious about what he said about the Jews, which he was deadly serious, but they only found out that when it was too late. All of the ruling class supported Hitler. That's a fact of the matter. And throughout the 1930s, as a matter of fact, there was no attempt was made to stop Germany rearming, which they were not supposed to be allowed to rearm, according to the Treaty of Versailles. No attempt was made to stop Hitler from occupying the Rhineland, which was banned again. That, by the way, would have stopped Hitler. It's a fact. Hitler could have been stopped in his tracks at that time if the British and French would have stood firm against the occupation of the Rhineland. They did not. He was allowed to occupy the Rhineland. Then he was allowed to occupy Austria, the famous Anschluss, the unification with Austria, and so on and so forth. Finally, he was allowed to take over Czechoslovakia. The British government played an active role in that, and Neville Chamberlain, comes back waving his bit of paper, I have in my hand peace in my time. Well, no such thing. Chamberlain was fooling himself. And then finally Hitler turned towards Poland. Well, that was a step too far, because Poland happened to be an ally of France, which meant that France was drawn into the war, and therefore Britain also, of necessity, was drawn into the war. But initially, as a matter of fact, the truth of the matter is, they were quite prepared to see Hitler advance to the east. To the east. I mean, if Hitler very early on stated, in his book Mein Kampf, that his real intention, his real plan all along, which he did stick to, by the way, was the conquest of Russia and the enslavement and the overthrow of the Slav peoples, who he regarded as inferior races. Both the Poles and the Russians and the Ukrainians, the lot, they were going to be enslaved and part of the Reich. that was okay. They wanted that. They were, as a matter of fact, there was a series, again, it's not generally realised. When the danger from Germany became more and more apparent, and it was beginning to cause some alarm in London and in Paris, there were some negotiations between the British and the Russians in Moscow. They were shuttling back and forth. So these negotiations led precisely nowhere. Nothing was done, I insist and I repeat, nothing was done to stop Hitler advancing eastwards all the time. Czechoslovakia was okay. Poland was a step too far, but there we are. That's regrettable. But the whole thrust was towards the east, and that was okay. By the way, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which people make a fuss about, it was, of course, in a way, it was a monstrous thing for Stalin to do a deal with Hitler. However, it must be said, from the standpoint of the Soviet Union, that was a defensive action on his part. Having failed to reach an agreement with the British and French, which he did do, he sacrificed, for example, the Spanish Revolution was sacrificed, was sabotaged by the Stalinists as part of a general attempt to appear respectable, not to be a threat to Western democracy and so on and so forth. They were quite prepared. Stalin was quite prepared to do a deal with Western democracies. They were not prepared to do a deal with him. That's the point. Therefore, realizing the position, Stalin said, well, okay, you're going to not play ball with me, I'll play ball with Hitler. That's why he signed that agreement as a means of satisfying Hitler, which he then hoped, stupidly, would serve to avoid Hitler attacking the Soviet Union. Of course, in the last analysis, it did not. But you see, the Western democracies, they now blame Russia, this, that, and the other. They themselves were responsible for the rise of Hitler. They were responsible for the rearmament of Germany. And they were responsible for, in effect, for encouraging Hitler to turn east in the hope that he was going to attack the Soviet Union. That was the idea. By the way, even when he did attack the Soviet Union in 1941, don't you think that people were in Britain, but ordinary people, workers, were outraged? But a section of the Tory party, I think it was Lord Brabazon, I can't remember, I'm speaking from memory, he actually said words to the effect of, this is very good, because now they're at each other's throats. They will fight each other to exhaustion, and then we will step up and mop them both up. I think that a speech to that effect. That's
right. It appeared in the Sunday Express, I believe.
There you are.
And I think he was sacked for that, even though it was a fairly common opinion amongst Conservatives.
Oh, it was. And in fact, with the exception of Churchill was in favour of fighting Germany, not because he was an anti-fascist, because he saw the threat which would be posed by Germany taking control of Europe, and a threat towards the British Empire. The British possessions in Africa and India in particular were being threatened, and therefore he had to act. But he was in a way he was in a minority. In the leadership of the Tory party, there were many people, perhaps the majority, I dare say, that even at the beginning of the war, after the beginning of hostilities, were in favour of doing a deal with Hitler, of peace with Hitler. I believe, by the way, that's probably the reason why Hitler in 1940 did not exterminate the British troops in Normandy. When they were helpless on the beaches, he could have massacred all of them. He didn't. He allowed them, in effect, to retreat to Britain, because he still hoped to do a deal. He couldn't get a deal from Churchill, and therefore after that he started to bomb hell out of Britain. That's a separate question. But that was the idea. Many parts, but probably a decisive section of the establishment, right to the very end, was in favour of doing a deal with Hitler. It didn't work out, unfortunately for them.
Aside from the role of the imperialists in allowing Hitler to run roughshod over Europe, as long as he was pointed towards the east, you mentioned the Treaty of Versailles and the predatory nature of that treaty and the economic ruin that exacted against Germany. Yeah. That was also a factor in the rise of fascism, no?
It was a huge factor, of course. At the end of the First World War, the savage treatment. And by the way, let's not forget, the First World War was finished by revolution.
Yes.
Not by diplomacy, not by any so-called democratic governments. No. It was the German working class that finished the First World War by a revolution in Germany beginning in November 1918, which actually continued one way or another right up until March 1921. That was what finished the First World War. But they took revenge on the German people by starving them, by introducing vicious reparations and so on, which the Germans couldn't pay. That's what produced then the catastrophe of 1923, where the German economy collapsed. Hyperinflation and so on. Yes, it was those conditions actually that favoured the rise of fascism in effect. That's a fair comment.
So in the last analysis, World War II comes down to this enormous struggle between the USSR, with the planned economy behind it on one side, and Hitler's Germany on the other. So the Eastern Front was really decisive, despite all the emphasis that's put on, the war in France and the Battle of Britain and the Pacific Theatre in movies and histories of World War II here in the West. Can we deal with some of the key events of the Eastern Front, and why was it so decisive?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about it. There were different elements in this. There were different causes for the Second World War. It wasn't initially a question of Germany versus the Soviet Union, apparently. The initial cause, which is not a new thing, it goes back for decades, generations, perhaps centuries, was the power struggle for who controls Europe. And Germany tried it on during the First World War. They failed. And they suffered very badly from that. They then attempted to take their revenge, in effect, by conquering Europe, by defeating France in the first instance. That was the first aim. And neutralising Britain, perhaps doing a deal with Britain to carve up the empire and so on. Didn't work. But it's interesting to note, they went through France like a hot knife through butter. Despite all the talk about the Maginot Line, which is supposed to be impregnable, the Germans pushed it to one side and they just swept through. They easily defeated the French, and the British Army suffered the greatest defeat in history in Dunkirk. Incidentally, if there's one thing, the British are very good at one thing. They're marvellous at turning what is obviously a defeat into what seems to be a victory.
Mm-hmm.
Dunkirk, it was the biggest, the most humiliating military defeat in British history. And they were defeated. Easily defeated by the Nazis, by the Germans. And the only reason I think that they were not completely wiped out is Hitler was still hoping to do a deal with Churchill, which failed to materialise. That's another matter. That's the Western Front. But the Western Front was quickly wrapped up, such that the only power that remained independent of Germany, in effect, was Britain. Some countries were supposed to be so-called neutral countries, like Switzerland and so on. Portugal, which wasn't neutral at all, in fact. But no. The only country that still, in a sense, was prepared to put up some kind of a struggle against Hitler was Britain. But what sort of a struggle could Britain put up, isolated on its own? They managed by the skin of their teeth to defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain and managed to save themselves, to hang on. But basically the British were in a very hopeless position, as a matter of fact. Once that victory had been achieved, Hitler then turned his attention to what had been his intention all along, was to attack the Soviet Union. That was always the plan. By the way, many of his generals were against this. They told him. There's a long-standing idea, which is correct, by the way. Germany must not fight a war on two fronts. It must not fight Britain and France on the one hand, and the Soviet Union at the same time. Bad idea. But Hitler was convinced. I'll tell you why he was convinced. And that, again, was the fault of Stalin. Stalin, of course, carried out a monstrous, in effect, a political counter-revolution in Russia. It turned what was a democratic worker state under Lenin and Trotsky into a monstrous totalitarian bureaucratic caricature of socialism, if you like. And as part of that, he purged the party, slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, of old Bolsheviks, purged the party entirely, and also the army. 1937, 1938, he carried out a vicious purge in which he beheaded the Red Army, he liquidated the entire leading cadres. Brilliant generals, really brilliant, people like Tukhachevsky, who actually invented the idea of the lightning war, what became the German term is Blitzkrieg, which the Germans used in France. They copied that from the Red Army. That's not generally realized, because in the late 1920s and so on, there was some secret agreements between Germany and Russia to allow them, the Germans, to have some kind of military training and so on. They learned this from Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky invented the idea that the Second World War would not be like the First World War, a static war of trenches, but would be a mobile war conducted with planes and tanks.
Yes.
Which was correct. Stalin murdered Tukhachevsky and all the other brilliant leaders of the Red Army and replaced them with idiots. People like Voroshilov, and who's the other guy, the cavalry man, that thought that the Second World War was going to be fought with cavalry. This is just insane. When Hitler saw this, he said to his generals, and what I was quoting from him, he said, no, you're wrong, when they objected. He said, the Soviet Union is hopeless. He said, look, they don't have good generals. Stalin has liquidated the generals, and the whole thing is just a shaky edifice. We said one good kick, and the whole rotten edifice would come tumbling down. And that appeared to be the case, initially. By the way, Stalin assisted Hitler in this so-called, another myth. There's so many myths around. The myth of Stalin, the great war leader, well, no such thing. Great war leader, what do you mean? Here's a man that nearly was responsible for destroying the Soviet Union, single-handedly. He signed this deal with Hitler, and he foolishly imagined that Hitler was going to honour this deal. He was not going to attack the Soviet Union, because he signed this pact, which is the height of stupidity. And when Hitler finally ordered the attack in 1941, a surprise attack, it wasn't a surprise attack, because at that time the Soviet Union had very, very efficient spies on the highest possible level of the German army and the Japanese army.
Yeah, the Red Orchestra gave Stalin the date for Barbarossa. Yeah,
Leopold Trepper. They forewarned Stalin that the attack was going to take place. And so there was another man in Japan, I've forgotten his name now, but there was another.
We'll find him and we'll put a picture of him and his name for the video. That's
right. But in any case, Stalin was informed. He should have known. He didn't believe it. He ordered these reports to be put in a drawer and forgotten about. He said, put them in the archives, he said. They're worthless. It's a provocation. Even when Hitler's troops started to move across the frontier in 1941, summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, Stalin issued the order not to resist. By the way, the Red Army at that time outnumbered the German army in men and in firepower. They could have easily put up a serious resistance. They might have stopped Hitler in his tracks, even in 1941. But they were ordered by Stalin personally, do not resist.
The entire air force was destroyed as well.
That's right. The Germans destroyed the Soviet air force. The planes were destroyed, didn't even take off because they'd received orders. They were destroyed on the ground. Millions of Soviet Red Army men were surrounded and captured without a fight. It's a scandal. It's absolutely catastrophic. And most of these poor devils were sent to death camps. They were not treated the same as Allied prisoners of war. They were sent to camps where they were starved to death. Unless they were prepared to join the Nazis and fight against Russia, which very, very few of them did. Stalin himself, by the way, was in a blue funk, was in a panic, disappeared. Was nowhere to be seen. He was completely in a state of nervous collapse. Telling everybody, oh no, all of Lenin's achievements we've destroyed. That changed. The German army actually advanced very quickly, without hardly any resistance. It was going along and destroying everything. Before the war, Trotsky had warned that the chief danger for the Soviet Union was not so much the armies of Hitler, but the cheap commodities that would come in the baggage train of an imperialist army. And that was quite a correct idea. There's just one difference, you see. If there would have been an American army, by the way, that would have been a serious problem, because they would have come precisely with those commodities and so on, which would have helped them to win over the population. The peasants in particular would suffer from forced collectivization, and many of them were very seriously disaffected, especially in the Ukraine. But of course, when Hitler's armies went in there, they didn't bring cheap commodities in their baggage train, but gas chambers and execution squads. They came with this was a fascist, a Nazi army, a racist army, fired up with the idea of racial superiority, that all Slavs were inferior people, or only fit to be exterminated, driven out, or enslaved, which is what they proceeded to do. Now, once that became clear to the population, of course, even the peasants and everyone else realized what was happening. They fought like tigers. Of course, the working class, that was different. The workers, of course, would be loyal. Most of the workers would be loyal to the gains of the October Revolution. They were prepared to fight to defend the October Revolution against foreign invaders. The peasants, however, that was in doubt, except now it changed. And from that moment on, the whole of the Soviet, practically the whole of the Soviet people, there were some small numbers of traitors, but not many. The big majority rallied to the defense of the Soviet Union and fought like tigers. And that was a big reason for why Hitler was defeated. It wasn't the only reason, but we can come to that in a moment. The two reasons was, on the one hand, the determination and the heroism, the real tremendous heroism, of ordinary working people in the Soviet Union. The second reason, of course, which the West is never prepared to admit that it's a fact, was the colossal superiority of a nationalized planned economy. That was decisive.
Well, can we go into some more detail about that? Because you'd think that with Stalin having decapitated the leading brass of the Red Army, the head start that Hitler had in penetrating into Soviet territory, and the lack of support that the USSR had from its supposed allies in the West, you'd think the cause would be hopeless. But how and why did the planned economy, the power of the planned economy, begin to turn the tide?
Well, that's a good point. You see, it seemed to be hopeless. Everybody thought it was going to be hopeless. Hitler certainly thought that. He had big illusions. As a matter of fact, his soldiers finally, when finally they were stuck there in the winter, time was passing, they only had summer uniforms. They thought they'd be in Moscow in a couple of days, probably. Bad mistake. Same mistake that Napoleon made. It's a very bad mistake. Those who want to march on Moscow had better think twice about it. They just found out that again in this Ukrainian war, They're not advisable to march on Moscow under any circumstances. But in any case, you see the advantage of a planned economy in one very simple fact. You see, most of the industry of the Soviet Union, most of the productive industry, was in the West. Precisely those provinces that were being very quickly overrun by the Germans. So what they did was they dismantled. It was an incredible feat. I think unprecedented in history. They dismantled all the factories, the mines, the factories, the equipment, and so on. Were put onto trains and shipped east of the Urals, where they couldn't be reached by the German bombers, and rebuilt. And within 18 months, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in tanks and guns and shells and artillery and planes. Astonishing feat, which is never mentioned. By the way, you can see, if ever there was a clear case and proof of the superiority of a nationalized planned economy, even one run bureaucratically like the Soviet Union, there were many problems arising from that, but didn't take away the fundamental superiority of a nationalized economy. The proof of the superiority is in this. Theoretically, look, take Britain's case. Compare that to Britain. In 1940, Britain was on its knees. They were really, they'd been defeated, the army been forced to get out of France, managed to escape by the skin of its teeth. The whole country was in a state of shock, of panic, of people who were terrified. I spoke to people who were around at the time. They said people had never seen anything like it. The panic was something tremendous. So, what do you do in a situation like that? Expand production, of course. Yeah? And how do you do that? Well, according to the economic textbooks, which you read in the West, you allow free scope to the market. The market solves everything. Leave it. The state mustn't intervene. The state is no good. The market must intervene. The market will solve everything. Leave everything to the private enterprise, and free spirit and the market will solve everything. Is that what they did? Is that what Churchill and the Conservatives did? Oh no, they didn't do that at all. What they did was they centralised the economy. They nationalised industries which are key for the war industry. They took control of things like steel and coal and so on. Right? They introduced control of the movement of labour. You weren't allowed to move your jobs anymore. You had the direction of labour, as they put it. Okay. In other words, they introduced elements of planning and centralisation which you're not supposed to do. Well, how does that fit in with the theory of the free market? And what that proves was just one thing. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt. Why did they do that? Because it works better. Because a planned nationalised economy, it wasn't really partially nationalised, but in effect it was under the control of the government. A planned economy works better than the anarchy of private production. Full stop. I rest my case. Otherwise, you can't explain the conduct. But of course, under capitalism, you never get a fully planned economy. Elements of planning were present. In the Soviet Union, you had a completely planned economy, and by God, it showed quickly. It's a classic case. It's an absolute 100% solid proof of the superiority of a nationalised planned economy over the anarchy of capitalist production. As I say, within 18 months, they'd reconstructed the industries in the East, and they were rapidly outproducing Germany. And that proved to be decisive. By 1942, the German advance had been stopped. The German army was beginning to suffer defeats, loss of life, and so on and so forth. And by 1943, the tide had definitely turned. You had the experience of Stalingrad, for example, which is frequently quoted. Mm. I repeat, and let's be clear about this, this was a single combat between two titanic forces. On the one hand, mighty Stalinist Russia, if you like, the nationalised economy of Russia. On the other hand, Nazi Germany with all of the power of Europe behind it. Think about it. The vast resources of Europe, the economic resources of Europe. Hitler smashed the French in double quick in a few weeks. Yeah, the might of the French army was just smashed. In the Soviet Union, initially it advanced only because of the stupidity and blunders of Stalin, and crimes of Stalin, I might add. But once the regime had recovered, the people had recovered, and the fighting back, then the tide rapidly became to turn against Germany. In Stalingrad, finally the German army suffered a catastrophic defeat. I'm speaking from memory. I believe it's true to say it was a terrible, bloody battle. Fighting over the ruins of the city was reduced to rubble.
Deadliest in history, I believe.
Absolutely. It was an appalling slaughter. I think the Soviet sources, I believe, they claim that the Red Army suffered over 1 million men, 1,100,000 men approximately, soldiers, were killed, apart from tens of thousands of civilians that died in the course of this battle. But the German army, I think it was the Sixth Army, wasn't it? Von Paulus, I think he didn't. They suffered, I think, 800,000 losses, casualties, dead and wounded and missing. And I think at the end they surrendered, which was unprecedented. Of course, you see here the stupidity of Hitler, the mania of Hitler. He wouldn't. He should have allowed them to retreat. He should have allowed Van Paulus to retreat. Van Paulus said, look, I'm in a hopeless position. He said, no, stay and fight. He did, to the bitter end. But finally he had to surrender. He had no alternative. Position was hopeless. He surrendered the first time in history that the German, and Hitler actually made him a field marshal deliberately to stop him from surrendering, because whoever heard of a German field marshal surrendering? He surrendered. And I think it was 91,000, German soldiers were taken prisoner. I think most of them didn't survive the experience. They were sent to Siberia. Most of them were never seen again. But in any case, that was a shattering blow. I mean, that was a turning point. However, it wasn't really the decisive battle as some people think. Stalingrad wasn't the decisive, it was a very important. By the way, it was an important turning point. Incidentally, no less than Winston Churchill, who really hated the Soviet Union, and hated communism and so on and so forth. Even he was reluctantly forced to say, I quote, in Stalingrad, the Red Army tore the guts out of the Wehrmacht, out of the German army. And that was true. It's a shattering loss. Which really, from a morale point of view, it was a terrible blow to German morale. That then opened the way to a massive Soviet advance. The real decisive battle was the Battle of Kursk, which occurred shortly after Stalingrad. This is the biggest tank battle in history. And there you see the colossal amount of tanks which the Soviet army was able to deploy. The Germans suffered a shattering loss from which they never recovered. And from that moment onwards, there was an irresistible advance of the Red Army through Eastern Europe. And it's only at this point that the Western Allies begin to get panicky when they realized if they didn't do something quickly, if they didn't intervene quickly, they'd meet the Red Army not in Berlin, but on the English Channel. And that's a fact. There was nothing to stop the Red Army was sweeping across. Of course, let's be clear, they were sweeping across with a terrible battle. The Germans fought like tigers. Partly because, you see, the old Red Army under Lenin and Trotsky would have waged a revolutionary war against Germany. They would have combined military struggle with appeals to the German soldiers, kill the SS people and the Nazis, not against you, but against the Nazis, come over to us and so on. They didn't do that. And therefore, as far as the Germans were concerned, they were going to fight to the end. So there was ferocious resistance, and the Russians took many losses. But they fought like tigers. It was a heroic thing, really. Right through Eastern Europe, right through Poland, through Eastern Europe, taking heavy losses, but now they're advancing all the time. And until they reached the outskirts of Berlin eventually. Now, prior to this, there had been negotiations taking place between the Allies. By the way, the Americans entered the war in 1941. After Pearl Harbor, that's another story again. I won't go into it, but I am convinced, I have reason to believe, that the whole thing was a provocation, a deliberate provocation of Roosevelt, who wanted the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor to give him an excuse to bring America into the war against Japan and Germany, which he succeeded in doing. But after 1941, the United States declares war on Hitler, not just on Japan, comes into the war. That's again an important development. But Roosevelt, who didn't have the same attitude as Churchill towards the Russians, you see, the war, you've got to analyse the war aims here. The war aims of Germany are quite clear. It was, first of all, the conquest of the whole of Europe, the conquest of Russia, the domination of the whole world, as a matter of fact. Heute gehört uns Deutschland und die ganze Welt. Today, Germany belongs to us, tomorrow the whole world. Separate question. Didn't work out, actually. However, Britain's war aims was fundamentally to defend the empire. By the way, we're talking here about millions of colonial slaves, so don't talk to me about democracy. Millions of colonial enslaved people in Africa, India, and so on. That was his main concern. That dictated his policy to a large extent. That's why most of the battles were fought in North Africa, to stop the Germans and Italians from taking control of Egypt, the Suez Canal, which leads to India, of course. That was the reason for that. And all the time Stalin was saying, the Soviet Union was fighting a desperate struggle all this time, taking terrible losses. Stalin was demanding, open the second front. In France, that is. Roosevelt was in favour of that. Roosevelt had no interest in protecting the British Empire. On the contrary, it was in the interest of American imperialism after the war to destroy the British Empire, because the Americans wanted to take over, which they did.
Yeah, new kids on the block.
Which they did in the end, that's right. But in any case, Roosevelt had no problem. He had quite friendly relations with Stalin. They saw eye to eye. Churchill did not. Churchill didn't, under no circumstances. Therefore, as a diversion, he proposed opening a second front in Italy. They already had the forces in North Africa, as I've stated. They could go into Sicily and into Italy, which he argued, falsely, was the soft belly of the axis of the German and Italian forces. That was deliberately meant to stop the Allies coming to the assistance of Russia. The Battle of Stalingrad was raging at this time, and Stalin was asking for assistance. He never got any. Churchill insisted on it, demanded, and eventually Roosevelt gave way. That was a disaster. The Italian campaign was a disaster. Incidentally, when Mussolini was finally overthrown, in 1944, by a coup d'etat, by the way, led by another fascist, Marshal Badoglio, there was a revolution in Italy. There was a huge upheaval because the Communist Party was very strong. The Communist Party was leading the resistance in most countries, actually. And certainly in Italy, that was the case. They had control of the northern cities, general strikes, and the workers came out of the streets. What was the reaction of the RAF? They bombed hell out of all the northern cities. That's not an accident. That was a little warning, Behave yourselves because we're going to take over. Anyway, they struggled up through Italy. They made a hell of a mess of it, by the way. They could have taken Rome very easily. They failed to do so, but then the Germans put up a ferocious resistance in Monte Cassino. And the whole thing was a bit of a farce. There was heavy losses, not much success. And therefore the Second Front was deliberately delayed and delayed and delayed, up until 1944, when finally Roosevelt and Churchill looked around. They saw that the Red Army was galloping through, was rapidly advancing in Eastern Europe, but they thought, well, we've got to do something. Churchill suddenly, reluctantly changed his tune. They finally opened up the D-Day landings in 1944. They then started an advance, and a big fuss was made out of this. Well, no doubt it did have some effect. But compared to the Titanic battles in the East, it was a sideshow, really. That's the truth of the matter. Finally, Berlin was taken by the Soviet army, unaided. It was taken after a terrific battle. Hitler committed suicide, as you know. And that changed everything. And then you had an entirely new situation opening up now. That the Red Army now occupied the greater part of Eastern Europe, almost all the Balkans with the exception of Greece, and so on. This again opened up a new situation. That's somewhat of a different discussion. But all of this, of course, really speaking, the victory was down to the Soviet Union. The Americans, the British played a secondary role. That's the truth of the matter.
We've often said that war tends to provoke revolutionary currents. What did the threat of revolution, what sort of effect did that have on the considerations of the imperialists?
Well, they were terrified, obviously. Especially because now, you see, first there's two problems. First of all, the Soviet Union represented communism. That was a threat. And they'd occupied almost the whole of Eastern Europe and half, a great chunk of Germany also. And on the other hand, that of course gave the Soviet Union tremendous prestige. I mean, even among ordinary people. in Britain and America and so on. By the way, the idea that they were able to take on the Russians were going to be exhausted and they would take them on, that's shown to be false. There are similar ideas are floating around now, which again are equally false, even more so. But there was a mood of tremendous, of warm and friendly attitude towards the Soviet Union. In Britain, in America, in France and so on. And in the occupied countries of Eastern Europe, it was the communist parties that led the resistance. In France, in Italy, in Greece, everywhere. And this posed a serious threat. A serious threat. Like I've already mentioned Italy. In France, there was Paris, for example, was liberated by an uprising of the resistance led by the communists. Charles de Gaulle went in later, but that was just a side show. That was just a pantomime. In Greece, that was a particular case. And by the way, you see the cynicism of Stalin. I think it was at Yalta, was it at Yalta? Perhaps not. One of the meetings he had a discussion with Churchill. Churchill mentions this in his memoirs. And in the course of this discussion, Churchill passed a note to Stalin with a map, a hand-drawn map of the Balkans. And it was like sort of Yugoslavia 50-50, Romania 75-25, Bulgaria 75-25.
You have that bit, we have that bit.
Greece 90-10 and so on. You take this and I take that. He passed it to Stalin. Stalin, of course, couldn't speak English and Churchill couldn't speak Russian. Stalin looked at the map and he ticked it. He passed it back to Churchill. Churchill was even the cynic, hardened cynic like Churchill was flabbergasted at the cynicism. And he said, well, what should I do with this? Do you want, shall we destroy this? He said, no, you keep it.
Put it on the wall.
Yeah, do what you like with it, you know. Now, in effect, that was a betrayal of the Greeks in particular, the Greek Revolution in particular. Churchill wanted control of Greece. Why? Look at the map. Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Cairo, Suez Canal, India. Also Malta and Gibraltar at the other end of the Mediterranean. That was Churchill's interest. His obsession all the time was the empire. That was the reason. He needed Greece. Therefore, they sent the British army into Greece. My uncle actually was in the paratroops at the time. He went to Greece at the time, to Athens. As a matter of fact, in the 1980s, when I was doing political work in Greece for our tendency, he said, "You going to Athens?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, see, I got friends in Athens." "Have you?" I said, "Yeah, in the cemetery." Good friends of mine.
Deary me.
Good friends of mine. And he said, "I never understood this. We got there, and they were greeting us with bunches of flowers and fruit and embracing us and so on and so forth. And then the next minute, they were shooting at us. What am I supposed to do? I had to shoot back. My grandfather, who was a member of the Communist Party, by the way, was sending him letters denouncing him. "You're not my son. You're killing Greek patriots." And so what am I supposed to do? They're shooting at us. But he never understood. The reason was, of course, they did welcome the British troops as allies and so on and so forth. But then there was the fascists, the royalists, instigated by Churchill, who staged a provocation,
right?
Shooting at the British troops in order to stoke up a bloody civil war, which they did. In the end, of course, the communists were defeated, and Greece remained under a very reactionary government. But that's a separate question. That brings us on to another story. There was a revolutionary wave in Europe, even in Britain, by the way. I mean, if you think about it, it's astonishing. This myth of Churchill, the Great War leader. You'd have thought that Churchill would have had there was an election in Britain after the war, 1945. You would have thought that Churchill would have had a massive majority. He did not. The British soldiers came home after the experience of the war with a determination: we are not going back to what we had before. We don't trust the Tories, we don't trust Churchill, we don't trust the ruling class. Out. And bring the Labour Party in. They thought that the Labour Party was going to bring socialism.
There's quite a funny story that I've read that I find quite satisfying. Churchill's wife said to him when he lost the election, well, perhaps this is a blessing in disguise. And Churchill apparently said, well, it's particularly well disguised.
Well, that's a good one. No, Churchill was terrified. The ruling class. As a matter of fact, the first year of the Labour government, he waged a noisy campaign in favour of immediate demobilisation, demobilise the army. Because they came back with guns, by the way.
Yeah.
This was dangerous.
And military experienced and armed working class.
That's right. Yeah, he spent the first 12 months campaigning for immediate demobilisation. Once that was carried out, he then carried out another campaign accusing the Labour government of leaving Britain defenceless. But there we are, that's another matter. In any case, that's a separate question. The main thing is that there was a tremendous revolutionary upheaval. Unfortunately, the leaders of the movement, whether it's the Labour leaders in Britain or the socialist and communist leaders in Europe, frankly were not interested in socialist revolution and played a big role in paralysing the movement and putting it along safe channels, establishing safe bourgeois democratic regimes. It was, if you like, counter-revolution in a democratic form. That's what it was. And that conditioned the whole of the next period. But that's a separate discussion, really.
So we talked about the actions of the main players, if you like. We talked about the events of the war and the reasons for the way that it ended. And we've alluded to what happened afterwards. I agree that's a separate episode. Maybe we'll bring you back to deal with the post-war world order. Mm-hmm. But can I talk about what the people in our tradition, the genuine Marxists, the Trotskyists, what they were doing? What was their position? And what were the activities of the predecessor organisation to the Revolutionary Communist International?
Well, that's an interesting question. You see, Trotsky was a genius, was a really important, major Marxist theoretician. He had a Marxist method. And when he looked at he could see that the war was inevitable. He constantly predicted that the war was inevitable, explained the reason for it. But he also explained that there were important differences with the First World War, partly because of the particularly vicious regime of the Nazi regime in Germany. And therefore there would be a natural idea on the part of British and American workers. We must defend democratic rights. We must combat fascism and so on.
Yeah, quite understandable.
Absolutely understandable and absolutely correct from a class point of view. However, that wasn't the position of the ruling class. That was sheer cynicism on their part. So what Trotsky worked out was what he called the military revolutionary policy, which was a new idea. Well, actually, it wasn't so new. In reality, if you analyse it, it's similar to what Lenin put forward in the First World War, but that's a separate discussion. But in any case, in Europe, of course, that wasn't really applicable because they were occupied by the Germans. So, I mean, they couldn't really pursue much of a policy other than to support the resistance, which they did. But they're the only country that really pursued Trotsky's policy consistently. I think they tried it in the States, but in many so-called Trotskyists opposed it. They said he was betraying Lenin's revolutionary defeatism, which shows an abysmal ignorance of Lenin's ideas to start with. But in any case, the British, our organisation, which was called the Workers' International League, which later became the Revolutionary Communist Party, by the way, they adopted Trotsky's policy, which was this: not pacifism, not down with the war, nothing like that. They said to the British, look, you say Hitler is our enemy. We agree Hitler is our enemy. We must fight Hitler. We must fight fascism. Yes, we must do that. But we must fight it with our own methods, and for our own purposes. And have no trust whatever in the ruling class. Because look at their record. They published Churchill's speeches and so on and so forth pre-war to show that they were not really in defence of democracy or against fascism if it comes to that. So the fundamental idea was, above all, maintain class independence, For example, we maintained the right to strike throughout the war, which was generally opposed by the trade union leaders and the labour leaders. We actually led a strike, an important strike with the apprentices in Tyneside, which was quite effective. That was denounced by the Stalinists also, by the way. The Stalinists played a vicious role after 1941. Before 1941, the position of the Communist Party of Britain, really speaking, was peace on Hitler's terms. For peace, for peace. After the Hitler-Stalin Pact. After 1940, the moment the invasion took place, they changed their tune. For example, they had a conference, I think it was in 1941, in the summer of 1941, a conference of shop stewards and trade unionists to foment strikes, irresponsible strikes actually, to sabotage the war effort, because it was an imperialist war, they said, so it was. But in the middle of the meeting, the news came that Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. The line changed, and the conference was changed into a conference how to increase productivity in the factories. And from that moment, the Communist Party opposed strikes and associated itself with the labour leaders who sit in the same government as the Tories. There was a coalition, a wartime coalition. There were no elections during the war because you had electoral truce. Our communists maintained class independence, maintained the right to strike. And by the way, the communists denounced us, our communists, as fascists. They published a pamphlet called Hitler's Agents Exposed, It was being distributed. Now, the communists didn't have that much money to answer this. They couldn't have answered the whole, it's just a pack of lies that you'd need a book. So what they did, because the British workers got a sense of humour, they published a little pamphlet, okay, with a big letters, £5 reward. That was a lot of money in those days.
Yeah. £5
reward. So for workers, look at this. For anyone that can find one sentence in this whole document which doesn't contain at least 2 gross lies. And of course, workers were coming out to the Communist Party members, hey, why didn't you claim the reward and so on.
Yeah. To this day, I believe unclaimed, that particular reward.
To this day, it's unclaimed. That's a separate question. So there was that. And the other thing was, we're not pacifists. Our communists were not conscientious objectors. They didn't refuse to join the army. On the contrary, they joined the army because our class was in the army. They joined the army. And they served the army loyally as good soldiers. You see, if you're a worker, you've got to be the best worker.
Of course.
Workers have got no time for sloppy or lazy workers. If you're a student, you should be the best student. And if you're a soldier, you should be the best soldier. But at the same time, carry on constant revolutionary propaganda among the troops. Don't trust the government, don't trust Churchill, and so on and so forth.
Didn't we have a chap who was an airman? He was kicked out for his political activities and spent the entire rest of the war campaigning to be let back into the army.
Yes, well, the name of the chap we were talking about is Frank Ward. He joined the Air Force, it's true, and conducted revolutionary propaganda and so on. They tried to catch him out always, but they failed. Finally, in desperation, they gave him an honourable discharge. And he spent the rest of the war fighting to get back in to the army. They wouldn't let him in. But as he said to me, at the time, I could have won over my whole squadron, because they were all interested in our ideas. That was one case. It's an interesting, but that's the difference with the First World War. Because it was supposed to be a war for democracy, it wasn't really, but they were supposed to be. They had to maintain certain democratic rights, civil rights in the army and so on. Part of that was in North Africa, I think, the 8th Army. They had what was known as the Forces Parliament. It wasn't a parliament, it was a pseudo-parliament, a talking shop. Supposedly to give people practice in political democracy. And you had people who stood as so-called Labour candidates and Tory candidates and so on. And one of our comrades, I don't know his name, a member of our organisation, stood And he was actually, he stood as a member of the Fourth International as a Trotskyist. And he was actually elected as the Speaker, the Chairman of the Forces Parliament. That's give you a case in point that the troops voted for him. They knew what he was and so on. So our ideas were having an effect. In fact, when you had this strike taking place in Britain, the apprentice strike, the Stalins denounced it as treachery and so on. And the 8th Army in North Africa actually sent a letter saying, it's the right to strike that we're fighting for. That was an answer to them. So this was the reality of the proletarian revolutionary policy, which the RCP and the will conducted in a classical way and had considerable results as a result of that, you know. But many of the so-called Trotskyists, for example, there was an organisation prior to this called the RSL, which had a hopeless position. It was so-called revolutionary defeatism, which amounted to a kind of crude pacifism and anti-war and so on. I won't go into that. It's not hardly worth discussing. It really, by the way, this was the acid test, really. The acceptance or not of Trotsky's policy on the war was the acid test of who's a genuine Trotskyist and who is not. From that point of view, I think the RCP, certainly the will, came out as the standard bearers of genuine Trotskyism. Oh yes, on this and every other question.
Well, I've got one last question. Before I ask it, I've got something that I want to bring to our viewers and listeners' attention. If you're watching the video version, I'm holding it up now. This is issue 49 of the In Defense of Marxism magazine, 1945, Liberation, Revolution and Betrayal. It's all about World War II and goes into some more detail about a number of the events we touched on. It talks about Italy, it talks about France. It contains an editorial by Alan, which gives our general perspective on the real character of the war and talks about some of the modern events around VE Day, for example, and it has an article about Italian neorealism. One of my favourite films is Bicycle Thieves, so I really enjoyed that one. It's available to order right now. I'll put a link in the description. I recommend that you give it a read, and in particular Alan's editorial, because it gives a bit more detail to supplement this discussion. And the last thing I wanted to ask you, Alan, is why and how does the ruling class today in the West exploit the legacy of World War II, and why is it important from our point of view, from the point of view of the Marxists and the Communists, to tell the real story?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's incredible, actually, the depths of cynicism and also ignorance of the ruling class, particularly in Britain. These guys really are living in the past. You know, they think that Britain is still the empire upon which the sun never sets and so on, whereas in reality, Britain nowadays is reduced to a tiny little island off the coast of Europe, in mid-Atlantic, in the process of sinking under the waves, I think. And yet they continue to blather on about Churchill in particular. Oh, they all want to imitate Churchill. Boris Johnson wanted to imitate Churchill. Starmer wants to imitate Churchill, and so on. Well, I've already said I don't particularly think that Churchill is a particularly admirable figure anyway, but leave that to one side. Let's take the present position. We're at war now. In effect, Britain is at war at this very moment that we're speaking. They haven't admitted it. It's an astonishing thing, by the way. In reality, Britain, America, NATO countries are at war with Russia. How else can you describe the present situation?
And they're losing.
Oh, yes, they have lost. Not that they are losing, but they are at war. And yet, I can never remember that this was ever discussed or voted on in Parliament. Can you? I can. Theoretically, we're not. In reality, we are. And yet they consist. They seriously thought in 2022, where by the way, it was Biden and the Americans that provoked this war. It's an unnecessary war between Ukraine and Russia, in which the people of Ukraine are being cynically used as pawns in a great power struggle. the Ukrainians do all the fighting and dying. But of course, it's the Americans and NATO and Britain also that provides the funds, the arms, the technology, and more than that, they actively participate, the sanctions and so on. And they really believed that they were going to defeat Russia. I've absolutely no doubt about it. I've already said earlier on, the biggest mistake you can make in life is to try to march on Moscow. Don't try it. And they failed dismally. They've underestimated Russia now, just the same as they underestimated the Soviet Union in 1941. They grossly underestimated Russia. By the way, Russia is no longer a nationalized planned economy as it used to be, although it still retains some elements of that. It has some advantages as a result of this. But Russia is now a powerful, modern, industrial nation with a very powerful army, armed with the most modern and sophisticated weapons, more than a match for any of the stuff which they've sent to the Ukraine, or the so-called game changers. And Ukraine has lost. The war is lost. For goodness sake. The war is absolutely, no two ways about it. All serious people, all serious military experts can see that. It's evident. And nothing can change this. There's nothing they can do now. What else can they do? More than what they've already done. Sanctions, they've already introduced sanctions. Has no effect. Very little effect. Send more weapons. They've sent, how many weapons have they sent? Money. How many billions have they sent to the Ukraine? What difference did it make? What difference did it make then? What difference is it going to make now? None whatsoever. And yet people like Starmer, the man is a complete disgrace, by the way. A complete disgrace. To call himself a Labour leader, that is a scandal, to be honest with you. Look, there's no money for the old age pensioners. There's no money for the NHS. There's no money for the disabled. There's not even any money for the steelworkers in Port Talbot and so on who've lost their jobs. But when it comes to Ukraine, no. There's infinite amounts. Why is there infinite? They just said what? 350 million, is it? I mean, what on earth is this coming from? And the damnable thing is this. Knowing that Ukraine has lost the war and is suffering terrible casualties, to continue to push the Ukrainians down this path to absolute ruin is a crime. It's an absolute crime. What lessons have they learned? None at all. I'll tell you what. The policies being pursued, particularly by Zelensky and his clique in Kiev, and Starmer and the others, do you know what it reminds me of? I'm not saying that these people are like Hitler as such, but certainly it reminds me of the policies of the German ruling class at the end of the war. The Germany by 1944, they'd lost the war. Even in 1943, they'd lost the war. They could see the Red Army was advancing non-stop and so on. And yet they continued and continued and continued. Oh, we got this force, we got that force, we got... Hitler from the bunker was moving imaginary armies, fighting imaginary battles and winning imaginary victories. And all the time the Russians were advancing further. And Germany was being systematically destroyed. Ukraine is facing the same destiny now. But it's receiving the same criminal advice, not just by Zelensky. I think he's got a screw loose. Several screws, as a matter of fact, to believe that he can continue this slaughter to no purpose. Advised by idiots like Starmer and Macron in France to do this. That's a crime against the Ukrainian people. It's a crime. And of course, behind it is this, you're right, it is the idea, we're great, we're big, we're powerful, we'll defeat them, we're going to send a peacekeeping force. No, they've changed it now. A moderating force, I don't know what. A reassuring force, I don't know what they call it. Call it what you like. Absolute nonsense. Even the Daily Telegraph ridicules that. British Army officers ridicule that. The British Army now is not in a position to send more than 10,000 troops at most to Ukraine. The Russian army is getting on for 1 million. I mean, for goodness sake, what sort of dream world do these people live in? I don't know. I can't fathom. What difference does it make? And the Russians have told them, by the way, you do that. You send these troops to Ukraine, and we will target them and we will destroy them. Simple as that. They come back in body bags. In what way does that benefit the people of Ukraine? In what way does that benefit the people of Britain, I ask myself. And it boils down to this lunacy. I can't find any other word for it. Lunacy of men that are living in the past, not even in the past. They're living in a dream world. They're living on another planet, not this planet, not the planet Earth. They're living in dreams out of their heads of greatness and military this and the military. And now, sooner or later, these dreams will collide with the reality. And I tell you what, quite a few people now that are boasting and bragging about peacekeeping forces and all the rest of it, they're going to wake up with a hell of a hangover, a hell of a bad head, very soon. I'll give them to the end of the year at most, you know. And this is where we're led, once you allow people to have their minds obsessed with what? With historical mythology. That's all it is. It's not genuine history at all. It's a history of myths invented by a stupid ruling class, which frankly has lost all reason to exist anymore on the face of this earth.
All right, Alan, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful antidote to all the rubbish that I've been fed for my entire conscious life about the role of British imperialism and about the nature of World War II in general. One more time, I'd like to plug the In Defense of Marxism magazine. Again, there's a link in the description where you can buy your copy. But I'd also like to plug the writings of Ted Grant, who is the founding theoretician of our organisation. He wrote extensively during the Second World War. He was a leading member of the WIL and the RCP, and reading particularly the second volume of his collective writings was really valuable for preparing this episode. So I'll put a link to where you can pick up a copy of his writings on the war in the description as well. Alan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, my pleasure again.
And we'll see the rest of you for a new episode of the Spectre of Communism podcast next week. Goodbye.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists. The communists. The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.